Hello, I'm Faith Rogers, host of today's program, COVID-19 Keeping Up with a Moving Target. This is a June 23rd episode of DKB Med Radio's Coronavirus Educational Series. Thank you for joining us. As a note to our learners, we will begin publishing our educational series only once a week beginning in July. Please continue to join us on our full-length live and on-demand webinars as we continue to learn more about COVID-19. This activity is jointly provided by the Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, DKB Med, and the Institute for Johns Hopkins Nursing. Today's program is accredited for ANCC and AAPA credit, as well as AMA PRA Category 1 credits. Please visit our website for complete CE information. If you're tuning into our webcast, please click the red Claim Credit button in the webinar console to attest for credit. Otherwise, please visit covid19.dkbmed.com. Today's learning objective is to identify challenges faced in the early COVID-19 vaccine trials. This educational activity is supported by independent medical educational grants from Gilead Sciences Incorporated, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals Incorporated, and Eli Lilly and Company, as well as in-kind support by DKB Med LLC. All activity content and materials have been developed solely by the activity directors, planning committee members, and faculty presenters. With us today, we have Dr. Paul Auwaerter, Clinical Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Today, he will be interviewing Dr. Patrick Flume on his experience running COVID-19 vaccine trials, and this is the second part of their interview. Dr. Auwaerter and Dr. Flume, thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thank you, Faith, and delighted to have Dr. Flume join us for more discussions about vaccine studies and how they're evolving as we accrue additional information and vaccines in an effort to try to combat the pandemic. So Patrick, I was wondering, you said you're conducting still 3 vaccine studies. What kind of questions have come up now that the United States has 3 vaccines that look highly effective, but are still investigational under FDA emergency use authorization?
So that's a very good question. In the study of any drug, you're always comparing it against something. That would either be a placebo because there is no effective therapy, or it would be to whatever the standard of care would be. So at the beginning of all this pandemic, there was nothing. You would compare it to placebo, which is really the purest. And so when you launch these studies, when other products now become authorized, then the patients or the subjects who are participating in the study might want to know for sure that they've had the vaccine. So this creates some challenges to how you implement that. One is, do you break the blind and just inform them? And that's essentially what we had to do with pretty much everybody that was involved in the study, because they might, if they know they have access to an authorized vaccine, they definitely want to know, did I get the real thing, or should I go ahead and get the authorized vaccine? Some of the sponsors took a different approach in that there was an opportunity to do a crossover design in which you don't necessarily have to break the blind, but you can now inform the subjects that they are going to receive the vaccine. So if in the beginning they had received the placebo, now on the sort of restart of that phase, they now are getting active vaccine. If they got active vaccine, they're now getting placebo. They might suspect what they had received based on any kind of side effects, but they don't actually know. So it keeps some of the control over the study. But it raises a whole new territory in terms of how you not only keep your subjects engaged in the study, because you really want to get continued data on them, but also making sure that you can do it in a balanced and ethical manner.
Yeah, those are highly challenging, only because we don't yet have a comparator that's truly FDA approved, which would perhaps make this a bit easier. And of course, all the studies are in such a compressed fashion. They really have to adapt. How many of the patients that have had that crossover design, how many have decided to stick as an estimate versus those that have decided to, get one of the EUA vaccines?
So even in our studies, if we were unblinding someone, that the the sponsor still requested that we try to keep them engaged in the study. They no longer will contribute to the primary endpoint per se of who gets illness with COVID, but you are still accruing data to know this, because another question in there, these other secondary endpoints, is what's the longevity of their antibody response and what is their long-term protection? Because there were people who requested to be unblinded, and we then learned that they had actually received active vaccine. So although they are now removed from the blinded portion of the study, there is still learning from the long-term monitoring of those subjects. But in those who either became unblinded or committed to the crossover design, the retention rate has actually been quite high. And I would say it's far north of 50%. And I think that's a testament to people who volunteer for these studies realize that there is value. It's not just that they got a vaccine, that they are contributing to our knowledge and how we manage this in the future.
So one of the questions that have come up, as you mentioned, you want to see how long antibody responses are and protection, and hoping to keep people enrolled. But why are these vaccine studies, for the most part, 6 months in duration? My basis of understanding is that most vaccine side effects you tend to see in the first 4 or 6 weeks or so. Is it more for efficacy reasons that it's 6 months instead of 3, or is there really a lot of value with longer term safety data in those remaining months? What's your view?
There's a couple of reasons, and actually our studies in their total length, they're 2 years in duration. The efficacy aspect of this, the primary endpoint was prevention of symptomatic COVID. And so unlike some studies where you say, I'm going to test the benefit of this drug and we're going to see where things are at 6 months and see whether group A is different than group B, this is event related. And so what you're doing is, although you're monitoring them long-term for antibody response and safety issues, the endpoint is when they become sick. And so what you're doing is you're accumulating these cases. And when you have a certain number of cases that you've predetermined is sufficient to see if there's protection, you break the blind on those and you see, well, where is the difference? So in an area which is very hot with infection, it doesn't take long at all to get to that point. And that's where you saw the early data with Pfizer and Moderna reporting 90–95% efficacy. But that doesn't tell you whether that protection continues beyond that 2 months or 3 months of data acquisition. And because what if these curves came back together by 6 months? So it would tell you that's a short-lived benefit. So you do get added efficacy data going out for longer durations. And we saw reports coming from some of these sponsors that there was indeed still protection at 6 months and at 9. There's the safety aspect in terms of, are there long-term safety issues? I agree that mostly for vaccines, the safety issues are all in that first couple of weeks, actually, in terms of side effects, whether they're serious or not. Most of the long-term side effects have been debunked that have been reported. But even when you're looking at efficacy, looking at antibody levels, you can make predictions about whether that is a protective antibody level, but you don't know that for certain, especially when there are variants involved. And keep in mind that there's other aspects of the immune response, including cell-mediated immunity. It's not measured by an antibody response. And so you still need to look at clinical outcomes to really determine that benefit.
At least amongst your vaccine participants, I think many patients feel studies go on for such a long time to try to prove that these vaccines are indeed safe. What's your sense from vaccine participants? Do they understand that the duration of the study is more efficacy driven as opposed to safety? I think this is a message that sometimes is lost and people are waiting for full FDA approval, for example. So.
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you to all our participants in any clinical trial. These are people who are contributing. There are different reasons why they participate. But the bottom line is all of us have taken a medicine at some point, And we have to remember that somebody volunteered to figure out if that medicine was safe and effective. There was an enormous enthusiasm for participation in the vaccine trial, and that probably all was driven in the hopes they'd get the vaccine and have some protection. We get that, but like I say, they've had a high retention rate in these studies. So as long as we don't make the study too burdensome, that we don't try to collect too much information that it causes too much fatigue, and continue to thank our participants and encourage them that there is value to this. And as you see with all the news coming out about these variants and the questions about whether these vaccines will offer protection for the variants, I think they are still motivated to try to know whether they too are protected, whether they should get a booster vaccine, or whether, what the future may be. So I find that it's very important to stay in communication with your participants and keep reminding them of the value and the importance of it, and thank them for their participation.
What's your sense, Patrick, about the studies and the fact that, unlike most vaccine studies where the knowledge is contained within the study, with EUAs, at least not for some of the vaccines you have, but the Johnson & Johnson one at least, there's a much larger group of people that have received the vaccine for which there's at least safety data and this sort of information. What's your sense of trying to how to integrate that, at least, if you were, for example, sitting on the FDA, for example, how do you balance sort of the study knowledge within there, and then also all this reporting data of side effects that you hear in the news, and we're not sure if myocarditis is a vaccine side effect or not, or tinnitus, or any of a host of things like Bell's palsy and so on.
Yeah, we have to remember that there's all kinds of data that contribute, and we have to try to sort that. And in a blinded controlled study, we have greater ability to try to tease out whether there is a safety issue or not. People that look at any package insert look at these long lists of potential side effects and the percentage of patient subjects who participated, had them, and trying to make a judgment on that. But as you know, in clinical trials, things happen. And what we tell our subjects is, you just tell us. We're not trying to figure out whether it's because of the drug or because of the vaccine. We just want to know. You stub your toe, you lose your hair, you get a rash, we write it all down. And then when you break the code, you can see if these events seem to occur more often in the vaccinated versus the placebo. There is the post-marketing observations, which is where we get a lot more data, and we have to be careful about the anecdote. An event happened, and you don't know with certainty that it was because of the drug or the vaccine, but you can be suspicious about it, particularly if there are multiple similar cases. So in a drug study where, say, we enroll 500 or 1,000 patients, and but the adverse event of concern occurs in 1 in 20,000, well, we're not going to pick it up until now we start treating many, many people. So in the vaccine studies, generally they were about 30,000 subjects, which is a lot. So you can know a lot about safety issues. But now that you've begun to vaccinate millions of people, you have the greater potential to pick up side effects. And what we have to be careful about is if you do find an event that seems like it's got some connection to the vaccine, even if it's rare, 1 in a million cases, you then have to balance that risk against the risk of not having vaccinated people. And for anyone who's taken care of the patients affected by COVID, you've seen that the side effects are quite severe, not just death, but very severe complications, prolonged hospitalizations, and even this post-COVID syndrome that we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, I'm reminded of over the years concerns about Guillain-Barré syndrome and influenza, and it was very hard to discern the frequency, since Guillain-Barré occurs and is well known to occur after Campylobacter infection, for example, but less certain it's truly tied to influenza, but there are temporally associated cases. Of course, when you have very rare events, such as with the Janssen vaccine, or AstraZeneca, these very unusual clots, that sort of raises the attention, even though the frequency is 1 in a million, perhaps, or something of that line. It just then, as you pointed out, has public health balance with the efficacy of the vaccine. What was sort of the response, since you do have both AstraZeneca and Janssen participants? I assume most of them had already gotten past the point of recent immunization.
Yes, and it doesn't mean that their fears don't, are there, and you have to find a way to communicate, and we have to work with the companies to make sure that the communication is consistent, accurate, and in a language that the subjects can understand. You may remember that early in the AstraZeneca study, there was a hold put on it because of an unusual neurologic event that happened in the UK. And it took the FDA a bit longer to decide that they were going to permit continued, ongoing conduct of the study. So that creates apprehension and nervousness, and people are trying to figure out what's happening. The issue with the J&J, with the clotting, I had people calling me that had received the vaccine, in an authorized manner and wanting to know what their risks were, and they were well past the time frame. And again, the risks are very, very rare. But and even with the Guillain-Barré story, the FDA tracks and the CDC tracks these events, still not knowing if there's a connection with vaccines. And the numbers that occur in a given year in the U.S., you can count on one hand. And yet you think of the millions of vaccines. So these are events that happen. Are they due to the vaccine? Perhaps. Can we figure out the mechanism? And I'll use as an example the early rollout in the UK. There was anaphylaxis that occurred in some subjects. And so that we learned then that you can have a different strategy for some people. If we were to figure out the clotting issue, it might be that we would identify some people at greater risk that perhaps should not get the vaccine, or some other prophylactic measure could be instituted. But you got to understand the pathophysiology before you can recommend anything.
Yeah, I think these are some of the thorniest issues, these very rare events. It's sort of what I call the fear of flying, where there's uncertainty. And of course, people crave certainty. And we in science at least try to balance that, but it's often a very hard perspective. Well, I really wanted to thank you for some of the insights on as an investigator conducting vaccine trials, but also want to thank you for indeed carrying out these trials, you and your staff, as well as the patients, which has just been invaluable contribution to the success of vaccines, which we're now really witnessing at this stage.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found these series instructive, and look forward to our next session in the upcoming weeks.
If you're tuning into our webcast, please click the red Claim Credit button in the webinar console to attest for credit. Otherwise, please visit covid19.dkbmed.com. Any questions or issues, feel free to email us at the address listed. To submit questions, please send them to qa@dkbmed.com. That's Q as in question, A as in answer, @dkbmed.com. Again, thanks for joining us, and thank you for your dedication to your patients with COVID-19.